if you look at the way that landscape or the lay of the land, you're seeing something very similar to what you're seeing in so many other parts of the country. I mean, you could go to some random place in Arkansas and likely find terrain that's fairly similarly shaped, has like a similar uniform shape to it. You can then visualize and relate, I suppose, a place that has timber with that same type of terrain, and then just mow the timber down. And you're seeing how deer are moving into different pieces of terrain and cover based off of different conditions. Where when you're in the timber, you just have to guess it. But here's the cool thing. Once you see it, now you're better at guessing it. And that's what I probably would say has been my favorite thing about hunting open country. So I guess, with that being said, what are some of the first things that come to your mind about the differences between, whitetail and mule deer stalks in the experiences you've had?
The experiences, I was just going through my head with this, and my experience has been a little bit more like stalking whitetails is actually fairly limited experience when it comes to actually hunting them. But I was thinking, but I do have pretty extensive experience actually stalking whitetails, but when I was doing deer research and I had a dart gun in my hands.
Yeah.
And the nature of that was not finding bedded deer, it was stalking deer in and around cornfields mostly, or on edges, where I could see deer or bucks of a particular age class that I wanted to dart and get a radio collar on. So that was kind of most of my stalking experience with whitetails. It was usually summer or early fall or something like that. And so I don't have a ton of experience stalking bedded whitetails, a little bit. And obviously, I've gotten some just by, hunting with you guys, hunting as a group. So I don't have as much comparison as probably what you're going to be able to talk about. But what I kind of came up with, my overall feeling on hunting mule deer this year was, one thing I learned was that it was actually a little bit easier to find and to get within bow range or close to within bow range of mule deer. But it was a lot harder to get a high percentage shot. So that was kind of my takeaway. It was it was a lot of fun, and it was also very humbling at the same time and very frustrating at the same time. So I mean, and I'm sure this has been your experience too, like I could have taken some long bomb shots at mule deer that kind of got up and were standing there, after they've been spooked. But, obviously I'm looking for a high percentage shot that I know I can make. So it was, it was fun, and it was humbling, and still got a lot more to learn.
Yeah, I feel that even though, we've gotten more experience, there's, just so much that we have to learn about it, because the biggest difference that I notice is the open country. And mule deer obviously can bed in a variety of different places. I've observed them even in the places I've hunted in more dense cover at times, but whitetail just more consistently tend to bed in places where they have more cover, which is really important for your own cover too. And I feel like that's a huge battle in a lot of the hunts that you and I had in this past season,
Yeah, certainly. There's a lot of differences in just the the habitat that they live in, and then then of course just their behaviors. And one thing that I think that we both noticed is that it seems like mule deer stay bedded, or whitetail stay bedded longer, whereas mule deer seem to get up and move around more, which is frustrating when you're trying to either plan a stalk or execute a stalk. So that was one thing I noticed as well, certainly.
Yeah. I feel that whitetails still get up, but they don't necessarily move very far either. I mean, they do tend to bed longer. Their moves also are much smaller, it seems, where, you might see a whitetail stand up and move 5 yards, Like a great example is that North Dakota buck. When you guys were up above that and Jake and I were stalking, he stood up and really didn't do anything and just bedded right back down. Where I feel like the mule deer, sometimes it's like the wind kind of swirls and they just stand up and then they might just move 3/4 of a mile. Not because they smell you, just because nothing,
And it makes sense. I mean, you look at, deer in general, whitetails in thicker cover have smaller home ranges, smaller core areas, and they have probably more resources available in the areas that they bed. Whitetails, if it wants to get up and feed, it can probably do that in a very small area, whereas a mule deer may have to move a little bit farther to find food or water or whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. So there's definitely some differences in their behaviors for sure that are pros and cons for stalking for sure. Mm-hmm. Sometimes one of the things I think we noticed as well with mule deer getting up and moving, it was kind of like a mid-morning movement that it seemed like they would get up from their beds and shift and go somewhere else. It means they're getting up and moving, and potentially you're getting eyes on deer that you didn't know were there. Mm-hmm. So there's definitely pros and cons with it for sure, with just their individual behaviors.
Yeah. One of the things that you brought up when we first went out there, I guess it would have been early October, you were saying that you had been noticing the deer bedding in shade, but then it seemed like that 4-day span where I was there, it seemed like that actually changed a little bit just based off of weather. Talk about your observation with that, because I haven't seen it as much.
Yeah, it was actually pretty interesting to. I guess one of the nice things about not tagging out is that you get more time in the field throughout the season just to learn more about what the deer are doing. So it was before you had got there, I hunted. It had been really warm. It had been hot, like mid 80s, 90s, something like that. Pretty much sunny, every day. So when they were bedding, it usually revolved around shade. Usually revolved around cedar trees or little cuts in the terrain. Blowouts, anything like that, where they could get shade and get out of the heat as much as possible. When you got there, the weather had got a little bit cooler, so we were kind of seeing a little bit of both. Some were bedding in the shade, and some were bedding just in more open areas. Later in the season, it was almost like it was a complete flip, where actually I felt like, and it's just the nature of that terrain of where I was hunting out there, where we were hunting out there, is that I liked that they were bedding around cedar trees because it was fairly predictable. Because you could glass cedar trees and find them, and then you had a little bit of cover to work with as you're moving in on them. But later in the season, as it got into November, December, and I wasn't hunting quite as much as I was earlier in the season. I kind of shifted to whitetails. But anyways, they were bedding out in the wide open more. When it was temperatures were cooler or even cold, they may just bed out in the wide open on a south-facing hillside or something like that, which makes it extremely difficult to get within bow range when there's bedding in the wide open. So there was definitely some differences in the way that they were bedding throughout the course of the season. And then this is a little bit less off the topic of stalking mule deer, but one thing I noticed throughout the season was just the differences in their behavior. It was kind of interesting in that when you were there, they were, bucks were still in bachelor groups. They were easy to find and they were predictable. And then I was gone for about 3 weeks from early October to mid-October. When I got back, it was more like early November. And all those bucks that we had been seeing had pretty much moved off. There was one buck left that had a harem of does in that area, in that spot where the high point on those buttes are where we would glass from. That's kind of the spot I kept defaulting going back to because it's the highest point in that area, and it was the easiest spot to find deer. So anyways, I kept going back to that spot, and then by the time early November rolled around, there was just the blower buck, that big 3x3. He was really the only one consistently back in there, and he had 5 or 6 does and fawns with him.
Interesting.
Or he was with that family group of does and fawns, however you want to put it. So, there was challenges with having a bunch of bucks together early in the season. Obviously, more eyes and ears and noses when you're trying to move in on them. But then I think that was easier than when that buck was just with that group of does, because now you got 7 or 8 eyes, ears, and noses. So that got pretty challenging. When I made 2 or 3 different stalks on that buck throughout November. I had one good one. The best opportunity on that buck, I feel like it was late October, and I found him by himself. He was rubbing a bunch of brush, and then he bedded down right there, got within 25 yards really easy, and then as I rose up and came to full draw, he just busted out of there. I think the sun was behind me. It was directly behind me, and I think my shadow, like he might have been seeing my shadow on the ground in front of him. That was about the only thing I could think of.
Yeah. I think I definitely think it could affect them.
But that felt like I felt like I was going to get him on that one. It was like it was an easy stalk. It was a short stalk, and I got right in on him and got to full draw and was raising up, and then he blew out of his bed and he stood at about 65, 70 yards, something like that. It's like some people will take that shot. Some people can make that shot, I suppose, but I think there's just too many things that can go wrong at that distance.
Yeah.
But
I mean, especially with about tripped on my chair. Especially with, I mean, a lot of the arrow setups that most of us are using are heavier, more affected by wind, stuff like that. But I think one thing that I was going to ask about that particular stock, I guess, was how were you playing the wind on that one? Like, what, I guess, was the setup like as far as using the wind to get in tight to him? Because I feel like that's always the most challenging with the mule deer.
Yeah. The wind on that one was, when I spotted him, I was up on that highest point on that butte, and he was basically, he was basically directly below me. He had been there probably the whole time, and when I switched to go to the next high point over, I looked back and he was right there. So he literally had been right below me, but I couldn't, I guess I didn't look far enough down. But anyways, I went back around and got eyes on him again, and he bedded down right there. And the wind at that point was coming from him to me. He was down below me in the terrain, up on that high point. That wind was blowing hard, right in my face. It's like perfect. I can just kind of cut around and then quarter back into the wind. Like everything should be perfect. And when I got down in there, the wind had just died for whatever reason. So it was kind of tricky, slow going. But when I got in there, the wind was kind of quartering, but it stayed fairly consistent. It was such a short stalk, honestly. Like it didn't take very long that the only thing I really noticed about the wind was that it just died down. The wind speed died down to the point where I felt like had it stayed up, coming to full draw and raising up, he may not have heard or just knew that I was there.
Yeah.
Whatever happened there. So the wind was pretty much just quartering at that point. Yeah, that wasn't a real technical one, but there was one stalk I had a little bit later in the season. In December, it was the only stalk that I had that it was another, good up on a high point, wind blowing strong in your face. These bucks were bedded a little bit lower in the terrain, but there was kind of a little pocket that they were in. And once I started going up, I just kind of went around the side of a hill, and there was a little saddle there to where once I got up to that saddle, it was going to be close to within shooting distance. And as I started going up to go up through that saddle, all of a sudden the wind is just doing this, and then they picked up on me. But it's just, like I say, the wind is so tricky out there. That was another thing I was humbled by, is that everything could feel good with the wind as you're moving in, and everything makes sense, and all of a sudden, like, there's just little micro pockets of terrain features and potentially, like you've talked about, sun hitting the landscape, or something happening there that they had set themselves up in a perfect spot, really, that it would have been really hard to kill them. Like in my mind, it was like, this is going to be an easy stalk, and once I get up through that saddle, like, they're going to be right there. Like, this is high percentage odds, and then the wind.
What do you feel like some of the things? What do you feel like some of the things that you learned, like, throughout this season with the wind? Like, I guess thinking moving forward, is there anything that you would take into consideration differently now, having those experiences, than you did on day one, let's say?
Yeah, I think just the more stalks that you do, like that one I just referred to, it just gives you more in that memory bank to think about when you're going on your next stalk. That was probably the one that sticks out in my mind, about trying to read the terrain that they're in and understand how the wind is going to be potentially moving through there or swirling, and whatever effect the sun may have on it, time of day as well. You just it's trying to take those things into account, and coming up with maybe like a plan B. You start to move in, and all of a sudden you're like, okay, the wind is getting a little shifty. It's like, okay, I may need to take an alternative route to get there where the wind may be more steady. So
I like that.
There's a lot there to take into consideration, a lot more I need to learn. But the one takeaway, as far as the wind goes, I know I was a broken record about this when you were hunting with me, is that out there on the plains, it's like when you think of the plains and stalking mule deer, you're thinking about windy conditions.
Grizzlies.
Yeah, Grizzlies, plains grizzlies. Yeah, you're worried about those plains grizzlies. Thankfully, they went extinct in that area.
So we got a quick side note in case this is too. Yeah, we got to just say what this is. One night we're sitting at our camp, and next thing you know, we're talking about when grizzlies roamed the plains and how crazy that would be. And that was Greg and I's late night talk, plains grizzlies. And I just think it's so funny that like that's where just two dudes sitting out there waiting to go hunting in the morning, thinking about plains grizzlies. But anyway.
And Lewis and Clark actually experiencing that when they went up, on their adventure, like encountering plains grizzlies. Can you imagine that? But so so the lack of wind was surprising to me and frustrating on I don't know how many different times where they forecasted it to be windy that day and it wasn't, or it was breezy, we located some deer, or figured out our stalk, and then all of a sudden the wind dies down, or you step down in the terrain just a little bit lower and the wind is calm down there and or is swirling. So that was a challenge that I did not anticipate to come up so often. I was thinking plains, breezy conditions, easy to move in. And I guess maybe I got spoiled on the first stalk that I ever did out there. It was a breezy day, and I located 2 bucks and was able to move in and got within 22, 23 yards, just really easy. Even crawling across some open ground to get down to them. They were bedded looking away, and with that high wind, like it's just such an advantage. I mean, unless you're taking a long shot, it just seems like higher winds are such an advantage.
Oh yeah, I would agree. One thing that we talked about too, kind of an odd condition to bring up. I don't necessarily hear people talk about this super often, but there is kind of a benefit too of those days where it's gusty, because I feel like there's this sense of comfort when they don't hear anything on those calm, breaks in wind. So if you get a little bit of a stop, go, depending on when the wind's blowing, you can almost trick them into being comfortable, it seems like. Because you can make a little bit of noise. And if you watch deer, we know this from having so many experiences where somebody's filming from a distance. If you watch them, whether it's mule deer or whitetail, they start doing this at some point. And I think they're always hearing you a little bit. But if you can almost trick them with that break in wind, you're not moving. I think that's one of those things that doesn't happen very often, where you're getting enough to cover you, but then enough to, be quiet again. But that's kind of a fun one. But I know what you mean. I mean, the calm days are brutal when you're trying to do anything quietly. It's really tough.
Yeah. And as much as I complained about it, I know we had a couple of stalks where the wind essentially did die down, and it was just really slow going, and you basically just had to take advantage of those gusts when they did come up, and then we got close, and then that sharp-tailed grouse ruined it for us.
That one was tough. That one bummed me out just because I was like, we had that condition that we were just talking about, the stop, kind of start, feeling really good about that, and we were even, at that point too, your confidence is going up because you're not only getting to point A, we had got to point A, B, and then we're going to C, and we had done all that without getting busted. I feel like that builds your confidence a lot too. Like we had those plan Bs and just kind of kept going with it. And that was really fun, and the bird was crazy. That's just
bad luck. I mean, what do you do? Yeah, I think just the whole experience of mule deer hunting and getting on a lot of stalks this fall helped to quickly boost my confidence in being able to get close to them. I mean, I'm sure, I don't know, 8 or 10 times, maybe more than that. Like I went on stalks where I got either within bow range or very close to the edge of bow range, and then something just went wrong. So that was, that was fun to kind of build you build the skill set a little bit and build a little bit of confidence. And now I still think it's like really tricky once you do get in close. How exactly you go about getting a shot. On a deer that's, say, bedded or something like that. Do you give them time and let them stand up on your own? Do you try to raise up, take the shot? Do you try to make some kind of sound? Do you throw a rock or something like that? There's so many different scenarios as far as trying to get the shot off. That part is. I don't know if you ever. I'm sure some really good mule deer hunters master that and know what to do in what specific situation. But that's one where you need some more repetitions.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll be curious to see what your thoughts on it. My conclusion, since I was hunting in cattle country, was that maybe just like making the sound of a cow mooing, like they're used to hearing that sound, to where you kind of make some low mooing sounds to try to you get to full draw and then make that sound to try to get them to stand up. And it's a less threatening sound, perhaps, or less unnatural sound.
Then throwing a rock over them.
Yeah, then throwing a rock over them, or perhaps whistling or grunt. I mean, I don't know. Any one of those could probably work. But I got to thinking, these deer are used to hearing cows all the time.
Yeah.
Like, I wonder if you make that, you come to full draw, you make that noise, and they stand up, and they see an object there. Well, they're probably used to seeing some kind of dark object when they hear,
especially coming up and over like you probably are.
So that was just one thought I had. But I'd be curious. I know you've been close to a lot of mule deer in the past few years, so I'm curious to see what your thought is as far as getting a shot once you do get in close.
I think that when it comes to this topic, I would say, as anything, it's situational. But I've had the tendency to lean towards go undetected. Because it does seem like in a lot of situations on stalks, if you can see the deer, whitetail or mule deer, if you can see it bedded, it's probably not giving you tons of cover. I mean, by default, right? There's different, every situation's different, but trying to go undetected also means finding that best place where you can get cover, which again is really challenging because you're also worried about wind first, then things like sun, where the deer's facing. But in an ideal situation, I would say you get up to a spot where you're in very comfortable range, you know where the deer's at. Ideally, you can see its tines, because then you're just making every move based off of what its head's doing.
Yep.
And, if it's relaxed, a lot of times, for example, you'll be looking at a deer quartered away. So you'll be looking at, that's ideal. Because you're usually not coming in directly behind them. At very best, you're getting them slightly quartered away. And if they're not moving and that rack's just totally stationary, then just leave it alone. He's chewing his cud. He's probably just asleep, like with his eyes closed, not doing anything. And then, ideally, at some point, he gives you some sort of cue that he's going to get up. A lot of times, I've seen where they start doing this. They'll start rocking, or they'll start looking from side to side, but a lot of times they'll just seriously rock like that, and then they'll just pop themselves up.
Yeah. Again,
this is all in a perfect world.
Yeah.
He stands up, kind of stretches out, looks the other way. Now, as soon as he looks the other way, I draw, and I can get my body into a position where I'm totally comfortable. Like, you're going to probably be on your knees more than likely, but just having that, perfect comfort, just like you've practiced as much as possible. You've got yourself completely upright. I mean, to me, that's, when I've done that, I've had the, best results. There's other times, too, where, I maybe look back on it and I maybe waited too long. Like the one that comes to mind that's, kind of on the other end of the how it could go is Jake and I were hunting on that first trip there, and it was the really, really big-bodied buck that we stalked, and we called him Fat Boy because he was just a huge-bodied deer, and we're not that creative with naming him. And he had got himself out on like a little finger, and the wind was coming perfectly over the top of him, and it was just almost so perfect that I didn't feel like you could come in above him, but I wanted to come in just at the perfect angle to where he wouldn't be looking right at me. And I got there, and he was comfortable for a while, but then he started moving his head. And for whatever reason, I didn't realize he was doing that. Even though I was super focused on his antlers, I think there must have just been enough grass that I wasn't... This might have been a mistake, too. I wasn't registering which way they were facing, because the grass would move, my eyes would change focus, and then I'd have to blink a couple times to see his tines again. Well, I sat there for a long time, and all of a sudden, he just kind of starts looking back, and I now can tell that he's looking at me, and he's just laying in the bed like this, and all in one motion, he just turns and runs. And that one, talk about humbling, like I was 25 yards from him for a long time.
Yeah.
And that one bummed me out because I felt like the angle was perfect, but he also never gave me a good opportunity because he was laying the whole time. And like, maybe I could have popped up, but I think it would have been a hard quarter too. And like, to me, I don't really want to shoot one bedded personally. I mean, there might be a situation where they're exposed enough and you're close enough, but even at 25 yards bedded, there's a lot of weird things I feel like could happen. And so I guess in that situation, if I could have done something differently, or if I could try something, knowing what I know now, chuck a rock over him, maybe he stands up and looks that way, and then you just doink.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's easy, but it's also easy to say that when it didn't work. But the majority of the time I've been patient, that has worked out. It's just, I don't know. That's a great topic though, because I feel like you could talk about it for forever.
Yeah, I guess that kind of reminds me of a situation that Ted and I were in a couple years back, to where we snuck in on a whitetail that we had spotted bedded, got in close to him, and then sat there for about 2 hours. Where he was bedded in some sunflowers and tall grass, to where we could just kind of see the top of his head and his antlers. And the wind was good, had been good the whole time, and we were just in the mindset of waiting. Waiting for him to stand up. He did stand up one time and rebedded there real quick. And Ted almost got an opportunity at him then. But, and then, after 2 hours basically of, I'm sitting there filming for 2 hours straight, like shoulders just burning. Ted, release on the string, tension on, like just ready to go on this thing. So,
too.
Oh yeah, to stay focused for that long when it can all happen like that. But what happened was the wind eventually did swirl. Like we felt it kind of on the side of our faces, back of our necks. We're like, ooh, that's not good. And then next thing you know, he's gone. Didn't stand up or to look, like he's just gone. So that's one of those where, in hindsight, what are the other options open to us? Trying to make a noise, throwing something. But we were less than 20 yards away. He was so comfortable. Like we just kind of felt like the best option was to just wait for him to stand up naturally. Whereas, you try something else, maybe more aggressive, throwing something, making a noise, and then then it comes undone and you ruin the opportunity. Then you kind of really kick yourself. I think maybe a little bit more than what we were. So it's like
patience versus impatience, right? It's like, am I impatient? But at the same time, conditions could be a factor as well. Like,
and the wind had been steady, and consistent the whole time. So we never felt like we needed to force things a little bit to try to get a shot at him, because we thought the wind was going to swirl, but ultimately it did. But that's one of the challenging things, obviously, in any situation, is just what's the right decision.
The one thing that I started doing more too, as I've mule deer hunted especially, is thinking about just getting to a position and chilling out and being like, hey, I've got the recipe to get one here. If I know he's right there, and he's 60 yards, let's say, but as soon as I start going around that to get to 30, 40,
Sure.
well, then it's starting to get sketchy. But I know I'm safe here, and I know I can shoot him if he walks around that trail right there. Like a deer, like a deer tree stand ambush, you know, it's like you're doing essentially the same thing, because what I also believe in a lack of cover is anything can be cover. Like it can be a color change in the grass, you know, something that just changes the way that the consistent landscape has looked. Because I feel like when you're talking true plains, no trees, there's almost nothing for a really long time, and then as soon as there's a rock or something, you look at it, you notice it's a rock, but then you just keep breezing over it. And it seems like those animals that live out there do that all the time. So, for example, a fence post in a pasture in Iowa probably wouldn't be enough cover.
Yeah.
But out there, it might be. Out there in the plains, you might have a rock, and that's enough cover where even if you're in the timber in Virginia, that might not be enough cover there. Like, I think there's something different about the way animals look at things, to where they just see that thing that's always there, or that break in habitat that's always there, and they just breeze right over it. And I think that's kind of where mule deer get that, like, stupid label. Because I don't think they see things... I don't know. It's obvious that it's different, but it's different even between a whitetail that lives in the timber, in my opinion, and a whitetail that lives out in the plains. Like the visual that they're using is done in a different way, but they're also really good at seeing you in the right situation too.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, they certainly can have the stereotype of being a dumber animal, and then you try to get in close to a buck and get a shot at them, and they prove you otherwise. Yeah, for sure. So that's fun. It was, you know, part of it was certainly humbling.
Oh yeah,
and frustrating that they're so good at surviving that you can get so close, and then you know, everything, and you think you have it in the bag, and then everything comes undone. So and for a variety of different reasons. So I think that's one of the alluring things about it. Is it's challenging, and it's unpredictable, and you know, in the right places you can get multiple stalks per day, which is a lot of fun too. So you just constantly, you're learning quickly about how to fail. And then hopefully eventually succeed.
Right, exactly.
Because like for you, I think you've been hunting mule deer for what, a few years now?
Yeah.
Or at least, you know, at some point during the season. 2 different seasons. Okay.
Two different seasons, but like probably 4 or more trips.
Yeah.
Yeah, so quite a bit. I mean, a lot of days.
Yeah, I think that's common from, you know, the people that I've talked to, and you know, you're watching videos and stuff like that, and you realize it's not something that's automatic, especially if you're new to it. And I would say your skill level is advanced compared to a lot of people, because just of all the experiences you had growing up and stalking whitetails and stuff like that. So, you know, just stepping into mule deer hunting wasn't exactly a breeze. Like, you probably, I don't know how many stalks you went on before.
There was definitely a point where the number of whitetail stalks that I had blown was, like, I mean, it's still true, significantly lower than the mule deer stalks. Like, it's a pretty big difference. And I feel that, the number one thing is cover. So, like, you know, we keep going back to this, or I do at least, that getting the shot. And I agree, that has easily been the hardest part. You're right in there with them, but then something goes wrong, where it feels like with the whitetails, because they're in more cover, you can find cover much easier. And whitetails have a different demeanor too, and this is something that I definitely think is worth bringing up, because we've talked about it many a times now. A whitetail is definitely more aggressive, just like by default is how I would describe it. Like, they stand up and they have much more of a bully attitude consistently across the species. Every deer is different. They're all individuals, and I do totally believe in that. But it seems like species wide, they're just much more aggressive. So when they have a doe, for example, that's the peak of a mature buck's aggression. So when he stands up, he doesn't necessarily think danger. He thinks, who's over there? Like, what other buck's over there? And I'm going to go fight him off. And I haven't stalked very many lockdown mule deer, but mule deer, when they're alone or in bachelor groups, it seems like they don't really give you the time of day. They don't give you that second look. Like, I have witnessed very few whitetails bolt out of their bed. Like, even on the stalks that we've blown, a lot of times they stand up, start looking around, and get freaked out and then run. Sometimes that's enough for you to get a shot. I mean, like the New York buck that I shot is a great example of, like, that deer saw me, but he didn't just run. He was like, I got this doe, but I don't also know what the heck that thing is. And then next thing you know, he's looking at his doe, and I'm standing all the way up and shooting after he just saw me.
Yeah.
Where it's
It'll
like
get him in trouble.
Yeah.
It gets him in trouble.
Yeah, it's just crazy.
I'm also thinking that footage of you stalking the one in the with Grant down in the river bottom.
Yeah.
Where I think the doe stood up, the buck stands up, and you're at full draw, and he's just standing there looking at you.
And he's bristled.
Yeah.
Like he's not thinking, oh, I better run. He's thinking, who's trying to get my doe? And it's funny too, because I know you'll believe me, but it's like I knew when I slid my butt up there that he was going to see me at some point, and I was pretty confident that he would do something like that.
Yeah.
To where I was like, well, I don't want him to be like, oh, that's for sure danger. But if he just barely saw me, I thought he might stand up and give me a look. And sure enough, that's what he did. And in that situation, getting the shot, as far as getting drawn, it's like as soon as he started to move, that's when I just drew, right as he was standing. But yeah, so that one.
I got a little tangent to go on because it just reminded me of something I did when I was hunting in North Dakota. This would have been, I don't know, 12 years ago. It was Christmas time. Like I had a permit while I was up there and had my bow with me. So I got to go out like one time hunting on Mindy's family's property. And I think there was patches of cattails out there and just pretty much wide open fields, just open country. But there was hay bales out kind of in the middle of this, or I guess on the edge of a bean field. So anyways, I was just huddled up next to this a hay bale, and this doe comes out, and she's passing by at about 60 yards away, and is angling away, like she's going away, like she's not going to come close. I'm looking just to shoot any deer, like this is just the one hunt that I get around Christmas there. So anyways, I know she's going away, and I'm not going to take that long of a shot. So I was like, I'm going to poke my head out from behind this hay bale, let her see me, get her attention, and see if that's enough to bring her in. So that's what I did. I just slowly moved my head out. She looked over, just kind of moved it back, and she turned and started coming towards me and got to about 32 to 35 yards, something like that. And I came to full draw, and she was quartering towards me, obviously alert, and I didn't shoot. I wasn't going to release that arrow in that situation, but it was enough to get her within bow range. Yeah. And had she perhaps calmed down and turned broadside, well, then maybe I would have had a shot opportunity. So that just kind of reminded me of that, like literally letting a deer see you to get it to come close. So that was,
What I think that's the cool concept of having some sort of decoy or some sort of I guess just decoy, right? Like, I've started using the ones for the bow, but I mean, I think at times you could even, I've honestly considered just carrying an antler and just sticking it up above the hill sometimes or around the brush or whatever, hunting more of like a still hunt style or like setup style. I use an antler all the time to rake trees and rattle whatever, so it's like, you could easily carry something and, kind of use it as a decoy in some situations, especially if maybe you're trying to place a deer, almost like what we do when we're turkey calling. If you came up over and you show them a decoy and then drop back and get maybe the wind in your favor or get the cover or whatever. It's a pretty interesting,
Yeah.
That's something idea.
That's something I would really enjoy doing. Is having 3 guys on a hunt, one guy with a decoy, cameraman, and the hunter, and like just like you're talking about, trying to position deer. Yeah, that'd be really cool. Because it's tough when you get them coming at you, looking at you, the hunter, and
a lot of times, close.
Yeah, you got to get close, and a lot of times you're left with a straight on or quartering 2 shot, which are really tough shots, or probably poor shots to take in most situations, unless they're really, really close. But
which works in some situations, but like in open country, you're talking. One's feeling like he's already close enough to you. If he's at 60 yards, he's just going to stand there. And which, at that point, it's a no-brainer. It's too far. So it's like, I just think that it's almost better suited again with a little bit of cover. And that's the fun thing to me about hunting whitetails on the ground, is you just have constant cover, and you don't really need that. It's the same with whitetail, I would say, as mule deer. Like when they're moving, they're not really looking at that much unless it's sticking out like a sore thumb, which that's your choice to a degree. Like, don't stop in a place where you're going to stick out like a sore thumb. But like a good example that comes to my mind of getting away with, what felt like minimal cover was the one that Jake shot in Iowa in 2021. Like, he had just got to a tree that was, that wide. And he was just, perfectly silhouetted with that tree that the deer couldn't see. And that's what I was doing, filming from a distance too, back just right up against a tree, which it seems crazy that could ever work, but the buck was on the move. He was fired up, and the sun was also right behind us, which, that makes a huge difference on that too.
Yeah.
But so one thing I want to bring up before I get too far down the rabbit hole is I think this is really a cool thing about hunting mule deer, and I do want to talk about this a little bit with you. When you're looking at that terrain that we've hunted in, we can use the example of where you and I hunted together. If you look at the way that landscape, or the lay of the land, or if you just look at the topo, I guess, you're seeing something very similar to what you're seeing in so many other parts of the country. You could go to some random place in Arkansas and likely find terrain that's fairly similarly shaped, has like a similar uniform shape to it.
In the way that the topo lines would look like on a map. Yep. Just minus the cover.
Right, exactly. So what you're essentially seeing is a place that you can then visualize and relate, I suppose, a place that has timber with that same type of terrain, and then just mow the timber down.
Yep.
And you're seeing how deer are moving into different pieces of terrain and cover based off of different conditions. Where when you're in the timber, you just have to guess it.
Sure.
But here's the cool thing. Once you see it, now you're better at guessing it. And that's what I probably would say has been my favorite thing about hunting open country. Like, there's going to be arguments left and right for forever about, oh, you stalk a mule deer, you're not as good as a hunter as a whitetail hunter in blah, blah, blah state, and you're not as good as what. Those arguments will forever happen. I say, don't argue about it. Just look at the benefits that you're learning for other places. And that is something that I think is very cool about hunting open country, is you can take those lessons and then put them into a guess in a different situation, especially when, if you're in the timber, you have more sign, for example. So I just think that's cool.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And the bad thing out there, as far as looking at trails and stuff like that might be left behind, is that cattle, which, and maybe there's some interesting thought to that, is maybe any animal moving through that kind of landscape, any trail may be indicative of what a deer would do or how a deer would travel. So maybe that's,
I actually believe in that.
Yeah.
Maybe that's silly, but
there could be something to it for sure.
It's just really strange how consistent it is. You know?
Yeah, and a lot of it has to do with just obvious stuff, paths of least resistance, saddles and stuff like that. One of the interesting things is where the cattle couldn't get to is on those muddy buttes, is you'll see where deer travel around those things.
Yeah.
That's where you can actually tell it's just deer doing that. So that was kind of interesting. One of the things, like later in the season, going out there, earlier in the season, I was kind of particular about spots I didn't want to go into just because there were so many deer. Like I didn't want to spook deer out.
Yeah.
Later in the season, there wasn't nearly as many deer out there to begin with. So I was just kind of walking through areas that I hadn't before. And one of the things regarding the terrain, it was interesting to me, is that how many pockets of cover there are where a deer could be, a big buck could be, and that you would never know it unless you could find a way to watch him go in there, or just to get above it, like just little nooks and crannies where it's like when I was out there in December, it's like I would just pin them. I was like, this is absolutely a spot where a buck would bed, especially like in, early in the season, hot. There's a little cut in the terrain here. There's a blowout or something. There's a cedar tree or a patch of brush here that I didn't know about. I was like, mark that, and then, okay, here's a spot I could sneak into on this wind to try to glass in there. And I'm excited to try that next year, because there's all these little spots where, we would lose track of deer. They were probably in these types of spots that we just couldn't see into unless we'd have moved somewhere else a lot closer. Yeah. So anyways, that was, regarding the terrain, that was one of the things that struck me late season.
I think that's great, because the same thing then again can be said for a timber setting with hills, ditches, just like the setting you're talking about. I think the more scouting experience you get, you start to realize that you can anticipate where those deer are going to be, to where you can kind of just go from one to the next. And that's yep. where my love for ground hunting is that. I mean, I love stalking deer, and that's like ideal, but I also love just going from one spot to the next, just trying to catch deer in a location, because I don't know, it just makes it makes it easier for me to focus flat out. I mean,
sure,
you've sat in a tree stand with me, like I talk just as much as we're doing right now in a tree stand.
Yeah,
it helps me like lock in a little bit, but relating it back to the big woods, I just think is pretty cool, pretty handy. It's something that you're not going to get as quickly as you will get scouting. Like you're going to just get a bunch of examples and a bunch of things that are changing, that are showing you or giving you a clue as to where deer are going to bed based off conditions. Like, so for example, the spot where Cole and I ended up getting that buck, we had been up there on the first day back into the area. We walked up there to glass. On the way up, I remember I'm walking up there and I point at some big beds. And I remember exactly what they looked like. It's like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how used are they? 5.5? Like, they're here, they use these, but whatever, we're going up to glass. We're about to go see 100 miles,
Right.
But every day we went back past that area, which wasn't a ton. We didn't see deer. Maybe 2 or 3 days we went back past there, maybe 4. And even before that, Jake and I had been past there. Didn't see that many deer right there. And then all of a sudden, we have the conditions that we had that day, which was obviously snowing, but super hard wind coming over the top, which put that bench that those beds were on out of the wind.
Yep.
And then boom, there's 3 bucks there on those conditions. So again, taking this back to a timber setting or a whitetail setting, I feel like I can look at a piece of sign, give it a bit of a rating on a 1 to 10. Yeah, I mean, that's a 5, that's a 6. But I mean, for sake of understanding what I'm talking about, if you got a pretty good feeling about that sign, now you just have to pick the condition and just hold true to that.
Yep.
Because darn it, he's going to be there on that condition, and he is not going to be there when those conditions aren't right.
Right.
That is probably the number one takeaway that I have from hunting open country, man. Like, I love that. Because
that's
now
awesome.
you go into a place that's got timber and you're not maybe going to see a deer for days. But when those conditions hit for that bed, you can trust it. And you can be patient. You can get impatient, a little bit more patient.
Maybe get you up in a tree in a saddle or something, huh?
Yeah, maybe.
Or at least sit tight on the ground for a while.
That's more likely.
Yep.
But yeah, I like that a lot. I mean, I feel like that's been a really cool thing about hunting, really specifically the mule deer, is it gives you an in-depth look at how condition based these deer really are bedding. And it's happening everywhere. We're just not always seeing it. And therefore, if you make a guess, you might be guessing for the wrong reasons, and you don't even know it because you don't see anything.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that was interesting to me. I never really considered scouting for mule deer spots to hunt, but and not that it's necessary. I mean, just by default, open country animals are usually you can just find them and and get in the game. But going around to these spots where we were seeing deer in, or that maybe more so that we couldn't see into, and realizing there's beds here, there's rubs here, there's deer that were bedding here that we just couldn't see. So it's kind of exciting to have more of those spots in mind, more ways to go about hunting that particular spot or that kind of terrain, and knowing that if you do get in, it's going to be a lot tighter. Like, to actually see into these spots, it's going to be tight.
Oh yeah.
To begin with, like you're getting close to begin with, 100 yards or something like that. And if one's in there, it's going to be a short stalk. But it's
and your whole glassing strategy is different at that point, right? Where you're up on the high point, you can see 100 miles. You're just flying through with binos until you pick out a shape, and then maybe you get down on a spot. And I mean, I think we do a lot of scanning in tight with the spotter too, but and you get down into those ditches like you're talking about. And we're talking creeping up over the top, looking for the tip of a tine at 75 yards. Like that's
what it would be.
Tricky.
Yeah. Like
but
I said,
it certainly helps if you know the spot.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what I was doing, is just learning the lay of the land, and just marking these spots. And on this wind, I can sneak up behind this little hill, glass into this patch of whatever kind of brush it is that they bed in, and or there was a cedar tree right here, and there's some rubs next to it. Yeah, I'm excited about that for next year.
What do you feel like? I guess. Is there anything that comes to mind, like just because I always try to, compare whitetail and mule deer and what you can learn from one to the other. Is there anything that comes to your mind in addition that, like, that experience has helped give you confidence for, I guess, whitetail hunting or hunting even in a different setting?
It's a little bit tougher to relate it because most of my whitetail hunting is done from a tree, and I'm limited by camera gear. That tends to be one, because I self-film a lot, that tends to be like one limitation that I find, that usually I kind of hunt or have to set up a certain way to be able to self-film. So I haven't quite translated a lot from the mule deer hunting yet to my whitetail game that I can think of, other than just generally just stalking, getting repetitions with stalking and just building that confidence and the ability to do that.
What about this? Certainly there's been something with wind that you could relate it to.
Oh yeah.
Because, like, essentially, even though you're whitetail hunting, you obviously still have to be paying attention to the wind. I would say that there's probably some of those terrain things that you've noticed that
certainly
probably have been helpful.
Yeah. Terrain features and trying to predict wind, predict where it's going to swirl, and one of the things that I hadn't considered a whole lot that you talked about when we were out there is the way that, the sun hitting certain parts of the landscape and what that would do and how it changes as the sun shifts as well. There was that was interesting to try to consider that and predict wind movement and thermals and swirling on a finer scale.
Yeah. I feel like hunting in a lot of the hills in Ohio that we've hunted, that's been it's forced us into having to pay attention to things to a point that it's just ridiculous, really, because you're not getting that super consistent wind. How do you try to predict how it's going to run off of terrain? And the one thing that I guess we've tried to pay attention to is where hillsides are heating versus cooling. And some good examples of that would be if you watch like how fog rolls over hills.
Sure.
To me, it seems like a lot of times it's just following those, those hot, cold, and I think that there seems to be some consistency to that where, you can get as far down the rabbit hole as you want, but I feel like trying to keeping it simple. This is how I started thinking about it, and then obviously there's variations. If a hillside is getting hit with sun, and then there's one that's deep dark shade, this has a tendency to be pulling up. Your predominant wind can change that a little bit. Like let's say you have a wind coming, head on, it might kind of quarter it up the hill versus bring it down, where on this side that wind is likely going to kind of drop down. And that's like really the examples that I've started experimenting with that the most has been whitetails in hills, and then elk in the mountains.
For sure.
And it's just, certainly, you always hear like, oh, play the thermals. And it's like, that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But to me, that's what I would say is like the starting point.
Yeah.
But, and it seems to, I guess it just seemed to be the case when we were out there together. Like there was that one stalk that we had where I'm trying to think, the 3 bucks had went into the cedars and we didn't know exactly where they were. I think we knew where the blower was.
Yep.
But the other ones had went into the cedars. And just in that one spot, there was enough shade in there that we had talked about that there was a chance our wind was going to slightly suck up into that shade and kind of settle down in there rather than blow up and out of the hill. And it was a timing thing too, where it almost seemed like maybe they did that on purpose. Where now all of a sudden they've got wind kind of coming and floating in from a bunch of different directions. Yeah. And that was a great learning point for anyone doing this, really. It's like, we were always on the fence about it, and then it just didn't play out.
That kind of reminds me of the bucks. I had, like I said, one stalk I went on in December where I was, up high, the wind was blowing in my face, the bucks were upwind of me, so it was pretty straightforward to where I could just move at them, use the terrain, but where they were bedded was another little hilltop. But that hilltop, so my thought was, okay, the wind is steady coming out of the south, it's blowing from them to me. But within that little hilltop, there's a little bowl that they were tucked in. And in that bowl, and as I was coming up to, basically to see in that bowl where they were bedded, the wind is doing something different there. So it was like, even though they're kind of up on a hilltop and I just assumed a steady wind the whole time, that little that area, that bowl right there, the wind was swirling in there. And I'm assuming that's why they were there.
It's crazy how good
the
they
wind.
are.
Yep. So
One last thing on that, I suppose, is another thing that I don't really even remember the first time I tried it, but somewhere along the way, I started looking at grass and how that grass was moving around the deer or any vegetation, especially things like willows that have a, flexible branch, any leaves that might be moving. If you can kind of watch that, especially in gusty wind, that can really help, tell you what the wind's doing in a specific spot. And I remember back to being a kid hunting at my grandpa's. The one property has a huge valley, and it's what a lot of people would call a thermal hub. There's just a big congregation of multiple creeks coming together. And I remember being down there a few times when the wind was howling up top. And when the wind would get down, I probably didn't see any deer these days. But I remember the wind hitting the other hillside and taking leaves way up the hill and then way down the hill and across. And just feeling like that was, that memory sticks with me plain as day on those types of conditions. But, why I thought I was getting away with that, I don't know. But my point is when you can read that on the ground close to the deer, that can tell you a little bit too. And I think that it's one of those things that can easily be overlooked, but it's worth at least checking if you can.
Yeah. It's amazing how quickly it can change too. Like you're going on a stalk, getting closer, wind steady, then all of a sudden, it just relaxed and is swirling towards the deer and they're gone. So it's amazing how quickly that can change, and and how important it is to be able to understand and read the nuance in the landscape. Yeah,
it makes it fun too, because it's just another one of those things that you can try to get better at, because at this point I've really only been thinking about that for such a small percentage of the years I've hunted, and it's it's just fun to try to remember all the things. Dude, honestly, here's the funny thing about this topic and any topic with hunting. We can maybe even kind of wrap with this, because it's kind of just, it's almost a cliche. Everything that we're talking about are really, they're probably important things to consider or try to remember in the heat of the moment. But most times you don't remember all of them. And a lot of times it's the one that you didn't pay attention to. So it's like, there's a lot of things that on some stalks we might be doing one thing, but the next, it's a faster one and things go quicker, It's funny how it all works out like that sometimes.
Yeah, I just had a flashback of the brush buck when you were saying that. Like on some stalks you do some things, like you pin where the deer is at, or you mark for sure where the deer is at, and sometimes you don't.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh man, I felt pretty dumb about that one. So I suppose for people that maybe haven't seen or don't know what seen that episode or don't know what we're talking about, is that I just got all gung-ho on this buck, like he was in a patch of brush, and I was just confident I knew where he was at. And once you get down lower in the terrain, everything looks different. And then as we rounded a corner, there's this patch of brush. I was like, no, he was in a bigger patch of brush, this bigger patch of brush that I'm looking at up ahead of us. Like, he's in that one. And then all of a sudden here, big bodied 4x4 mule deer jumps up out of this patch of brush, and it was out of our lives.
So
for long though. We got back on him later. Had another stalk on him later, but it was just one of those silly things that wish I would have done differently in the moment.
Yeah. And the thing though that you did do that I think was kind of gets some redemption points is, I don't think I would have not slid down that hill and got away. I would have thought we would have never got away with that. I would have played it way safer, and I would have spent way more time, which might have not been the right move either, right? Because it was getting to be that point in the day where he could have stood up and started heading to where he was going to feed at any minute, and the whole thing could have changed. So I remember that hunt, there's two parts that I remember. One is that we totally screwed it up, and the other is that you attacked super aggressive in a way that I wouldn't have. And I really liked that. I'll always remember that. So that's a really positive spin on, kind of a heartbreaker book.
Right. I think the reason I did that is simply because I'd been on a few other stalks prior to that where deer were far enough away that I just didn't feel like it would register to them. My little bit of movement, because the first stalk I went on out there was 2 bucks that were, there was like 1,100 or maybe it was 1,400 yards away. I mean, it's a long ways away, but I had to go down an open face to start to get down in the terrain where they couldn't possibly see me. But I just felt that was so far away that there's no way that my little bit of slow movement is registering to them.
Right.
And deer aren't known to have great vision in the first place. Right. So at that distance, it's like they just cannot or are not going to see that. And then the brush buck, I think he was even closer. That might have been, I don't know, 600 to 800 yards away from. But I still kind of had that same feeling, is that if I can do this quickly enough, still monitor, make sure that he's not getting alert, that I feel like we can just slide down, cut some time, cut some distance, and that he's not going to be any wiser. That it's just, if I mean, granted, we were sliding down the hill fairly quickly, and I still didn't feel like that movement was going to register to him. Mm-hmm. And some people might say, well, these are dumb, unpressured mule deer. These deer are public and private land mule deer.
Those deer weren't dumb.
They weren't dumb. So I think there is a certain distance you can get away with some open, moving in the wide open, that just doesn't register to them. Mm-hmm. And
I think one other side note, though, is we were going right down that fence line. And remember what we were talking about earlier is like any cover is some cover. And I think that, any movement on that probably isn't registering to his eye, where if you're walking across the wide open hillside, that's a little bit different. Yep. I think that might have helped us too. I love a good fence line out there.
Oh, for sure.
A post. I mean, actually, the whitetail buck that Jake shot, what would that have been 2 falls ago, that he just dropped in his tracks. Mm-hmm. That's coming up a fence line, and we got to the biggest posts, and him and I were both sitting there, and otherwise completely open country. I actually have on my big wall of photos, I have a screen grab from Nick's footage, where it's the 2 of us sitting there. I just love that image. Yeah. It's really cool.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I kind of had realized that from your guys' hunt, but then also had that realization out there when I was sneaking up on a burrowing owl that was on a fence post about 100 yards away from my truck. I wanted to get quite a bit closer to get a better picture. Mm-hmm. And he was on a fence post down this fence line, so I just hugged the fence line and started going at him. And like, you just disappear. Like, I couldn't see him, he couldn't see me for a long ways as I'm just going down this fence line. So, and I got to within about 40 yards of him, just kind of popped out and got my picture. And granted, it's not a big mule deer buck or anything, but just understanding.
Pretty sweet. I mean, you get those lessons from that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that. So, anyways, lots of lessons learned out there this fall.
Yeah, you'll have to send me that picture. That sounds like a pretty cool encounter, really. There's one last thing I was gonna say. Dang it. Oh, it probably doesn't even matter that much. I'm sure we'll talk about it again at some point. Yeah, let's wrap up. I've already taken up an hour and 15 minutes of Greg's time. Yeah. So, yeah, appreciate it, man. And
absolutely. There'll be a lot more to talk about in the future. It's fun. It's fun learning together and getting to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, man.
There's things that your mind definitely thinks about, and especially regarding the wind and the terrain, some of those things that you really get technical about, that I really appreciate. So it's always fun to talk about that stuff.
Yeah, that's cool to hear, because then it makes me sound like I'm not so crazy when I'm just sitting in my own mind coming up with some theory. Right. All right, well, peace out.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening, everybody.